Tēnā rā koutou katoa. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou. Aha ko nohia koe, nohia tō maunga, tō hapu, tō iwi, tēnā koutou. So, as we get 25 minutes and you can have a break. So, I've put plenty of pictures in just to lighten things up a bit. But the topic I'm going to talk about is racism and state violence. And this was a key topic that was coming up all the time. As Leonie said, in the interviews that were done in the He Waka Eke Noa project, people were very knowledgeable about institutional racism, systemic racism. The other day I did a quick Google search on who has written about institutional racism and systemic racism, which Māori, and no doubts many of you will recognise your names in this room. And there are many more that I have not listed up there. So we have been doing a lot of research, we have been doing a lot of acknowledgement and a lot of analysis around the area of institutional racism, systemic racism. And as I said, the interview findings showed us clearly that a lot of providers already are also very aware about systemic racism, institutional racism, and are working on those issues. What I'm going to do in this talk is that rather than repeat what was said in the interviews around the topic of state racism, I'm going to look over my own career, my own positioning, and actually talk to you about 3 specific stories from my research experience that shows the different ways in which we challenge and stand up to state and to institutional violence. And as Here Aroha said, I've had 25 plus years of kaupapa Māori research experience. I'm a researcher for our own iwi. And I'm also a grandmother raising a 16-year-old mokopuna who's been diagnosed with a neurodisability. So I'm going to talk to those 3 areas to make some points about racism and state violence, and particularly to challenge the challenges to racism and state violence. So I'm going to start off with a report that we did under the research unit Te Atawhai o Te Ao, which is based in Whanganui. And the theme of this particular story is challenging the violence of state discourses and evidence, which is what a lot of our researchers are doing. And in this particular project, we looked at the everyday experiences of Māori when it comes to just those everyday things in terms of racism. It's when you turn on the radio, when you watch TV, when you go into a shop, the many different ways that racism can arise in an everyday setting. We interviewed over 2,000 Māori, and I'm sure some of you might have filled out the survey that we were running up and down the country. And out of that came 3 reports. One of those reports looked at the ways in which racism impacts our health. That when you start to accumulate a lot of stresses, that can have an impact on your health. And there's a lot of research that's been done that shows how those health impacts happen. That report also looks at the different types of racism that exist, the structural, institutional, and although we were only looking at the interpersonal level, we were well aware that that sat within a bigger context of racism. It's also important to acknowledge the history of racism, that it goes back long before colonisation came to this country. That you have to look back to things like the doctrine of discovery, the creation of empires, and that colonisation and racism came hand in hand. And of course we've got the global picture, the current global picture of neoliberalism, the war on terror, and all of these other terms. And I think it's really important to talk about colonial racism rather than just racism. There is a distinct and specific racism that is aimed at Māori in this country. It is intergenerational, it is historic, it is connected to the processes of colonisation. And that shapes how racism happens for us. The second challenge that I want to look at is mana whenua versus institutionalisation. And in this case, I want to talk about an iwi report that we did in the last year. So within our iwi rohe, which is east of Whanganui, it runs between Palmerston North and Whanganui, it's within the southern Rangitike. Within our iwi hapu rohe, which is predominantly actually rural farmland, and we've had a number of national state institutions built. So within our rohe, we have the Ohakia Military Air Base. We had the Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital. We have the Tangi Moana Spy Base. We have the Whanganui Prison. And that's not to mention councils, district and regional, and government agencies and others. So as an iwi, we're dealing with a huge impact when it comes to our people. And within our rohe, we have no town with a population over 5,500. So we're talking about small towns. But these major national institutions and facilities are within our tribal rohe. So recently we completed an iwi report, and the iwi report was on it was a historical site and iwi impact report on the Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital. And we did that research for the Royal Commission. Initially, when we looked at it, and this is the thing, is the context of that inquiry is only one small bit of the layers that the iwi has sustained and continues to sustain over the years. But we wrote a report about the history of this institution. And I'm just going to quote some things that were said in that report. From the beginning of colonisation, we also suffered the abuse of racism as it has played out in the marginalising of the mana and the status of our hapu and iwi over the 180 years since our tūpuna signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Like all iwi, we have experienced intergenerational impoverishment of our people into the highest poverty statistics and poorest health stats. Those abuses have continued on through state policy that has seen thousands of our children and adults placed into institutional state care, into prisons and into closed adoptions during successive decades. These institutions have all accumulated further stories of abuse that have impacted on the individuals and their whānau hapu and iwi. Abuse of our people has included disconnection from identity, disconnection from intergenerational safety nets, verbal and physical violence, including sexual violence, spiritual violence, and in the case of Lake Alice, torture. Like other iwi, our mental health statistics declined in the post-World War era. And we talk about another couple of generations to really work out the... Lake Alice closed in 1999, but we talk about, as an iwi, another couple of generations till that really works its way through the impacts. So when we did the report, we wanted to analyse that institution from the whenua. So how do we as an iwi approach this topic of historic abuse within the parameters of a psychiatric hospital that was built on lands where we are mana whenua? How do we account for the torture and suffering of the survivors that have testified to the Royal Commission and to previous inquiries? To do that, the report took a whānau hapu and iwi approach, and we examined 3 key areas of historic abuse. We examined the violence against the whenua itself. We looked at the violence against the taiao, including the devastation of a lake that's still there today that was turned into a sewage pond. And we looked at the violence against people. And we talked about the importance of restoration in all of those areas. So the third challenge I want to talk about is, and this is a whānau example, and I've called it whānau versus behaviourism, discipline and punishment models of the state, because it's looking inside schools, what goes on inside schools. Sorry, this annoying cough. Thanks. So this image here, down the middle of that picture, is a plant growing called kia. Many of you will know that plant, the kia. And the thing about a kia plant is that in order to be a healthy, thriving plant, it needs to grow up a strong one. So if it tries to grow along the ground, it doesn't do very well at all. It needs the supports of a strong other plant. And that's how I think of my mokopuna, who has a neurodisability, that he requires strong supports, and he will always require those strong supports to thrive, to not only survive but also to thrive. So I'm going to talk about his story of being excluded from school, but I want to make the following points. One of the most traumatic things for our children and young people is exclusions and expulsions from schools, and yet an incredible number of our boys, especially, and girls, go through it as if it's nothing, schools just as if it's nothing. It can leave a long-term legacy of defeat and hopelessness. And it's also a permanent record that's used as an indicator for future life chances. So it really sets up our kids. These photos were taken the day after my mokopuna was excluded from school. Both of us were feeling really overwhelmed, so we went to the beach and just hung out at the beach to try and get ourselves back into a calm space. So he was excluded because of a cockroach. What happened in the class was a student was handing out books, and there was a cockroach caught between the 2 books. So the student went whack and killed the cockroach between the books, and then went to offer them to my mokopuna. he immediately said, "You're not giving me that effing cockroach," and jumped back, and then he started to have a meltdown, which is fairly standard, that's a fairly standard response for him. But we have a plan in the classroom around that, because he can get easily escalated. So those of us who live in this space know that calming, de-escalation strategies are critical and plans have to be in place. So with the right strategies put into those classrooms, an agreed plan, often the rangatahi can self-calm quickly or go to a space where they're able to self-calm. Okay? Some teachers use a plan well, others don't, and they wind up in power struggles when they don't use the plans. They often face boards of trustees and disciplinary committees, and they're often, because there's no training for boards of trustees and disciplinary committees on these matters, anything can happen in that space. So if they take a punitive approach, the 3 strikes and you're out approach, which is what many disciplinary committees do, many boards of trustees do, our kids are out the door. And there were a number of processes which didn't work in our case. So in our case, the special ed teacher wasn't allowed to be in the room. The disciplinary committee had no idea, no knowledge of his diagnosis. He's got an actual diagnosis, and there was no attempt to be solution focused. So as a whānau, we fought back, we complained, laid formal complaint with the Ministry of Education, engaged a lawyer and had worked on getting him reinstated, which was quite a process, but it worked. The outcome was that the school had to apologised, and they had to reinstate a number of changes to the school. So they began, and they trained they brought in training for all staff on the particular condition that he has. For the first time ever, we were given an educational psychologist with knowledge of that particular condition who would work with the family. And we now have regular hui ahead of time. But that took that battle. And that's only one, it's the whole system we're talking about here. This is just one little battle winning. So I just wanted to cover those 3 examples of challenging systems, because I think although it can appear to be like a totalising discourse, institutional racism, it can appear at times to be overwhelming. We are challenging all the time in our different spaces, systems and violence. And I think I've covered really the importance of challenging the old systems, but we're also creating new systems. And I think that other people have alluded to those, and I think that's also an important area for us to focus on in the future. So kia ora, that's me, kia ora tātou.